concerned about this in one respect because I started my career, as Jeff announced, working in the Republican Party with Pete Domenici. At that time, we were resisting the Reagan tax cuts on Domenici's Republican staff, and we were accused of not being optimistic Americans. Well, people who are fearmongers now about deficit reduction and people who fearmonger about the incapacity of government to do anything that benefits our society are not acting like optimistic Americans, and I think that needs to be challenged over and over and over again. We do, unfortunately, come out of a difficult experience of the financial bailouts. While I think, as Bernard said, we went over the cliff and it was a win-win, or a less loss kind of cooperative outcome to bail out the financial sector. The unfortunate side of that episode is that the people who lobbied for relaxation of their own rules, engaged in excess and made mistakes, were the people who got paid, and the victims of those side effects are the people who did the paying. And that harms, that kind of unfairness harms trust and faith in government in the next stage to be an arbiter of fairness and balance in our society. And we're seeing that in the polls, we're seeing that at the Tea Party election energy that surrounded Scott Brown. I do think, as people spoke of last night, that the financial bill is better than nothing, but it does not even begin to correspond to the challenge that calamity created. And I don't think that is a question of blaming personalities. I think we're going to have to get at the question of campaign finance reform. This notion of fear, when I think about, we're just starting a project at the Roosevelt Institute, and the theme of which is transforming the American economy. And we start in the context of this aftermath of the bailout. We start in the context of a worn-out infrastructure that has been allowed to lag for, as you mentioned, 30 years, growing at much less than had been the prevailing trend. And as I try to map out this vision of what ingredients would constitute a transformation that gave faith to people that this would be over, I concentrate on the theme of productivity. Productivity of people 7-10 years in the future is the basis for resumed growth in their wage, compensation, and living standard. As Ben has written a great deal about energy and so forth, we are also faced with another formidable challenge, which is that we have been mispricing energy for a long time. And the side effects for the environment, people emphasize climate change, pollution, and other things, implies that if we price energy accordingly, it may spur investment in transformative technologies if we create the proper incentives, but it is a challenge to our productivity growth in the near term. Public investment, infrastructure investment, the American Society of Civil Engineers talks about $1.5 trillion of worn out infrastructure. One of the things that I'm most concerned about the stimulus program that we had, and it was helpful, as Jeff mentioned, it was necessary, is that it's not leaving us with durable, tangible benefits. It feels to people who are scared like they have just made a transfer to alleviate somebody else's fear and either left debt for their children or for themselves in the future. The benefit of durable, tangible investment is that when things, I'm quoting the New Deal now, like the Bay Bridge or the Triborough Bridge are put in place, or cultural institutions are fortified that last for 70 years, we can all point to what we paid for. And that positive reinforcement and feedback is part of restoring confidence in the capacities of the public sector. Education, public education, education not viewed as an input to production, but viewed as a fortification of a democratic process. Education where the lower classes in our society become more trusted by the elites as voters and as our participant, as effective energy in making good decisions for our society is something we haven't been investing in for 20 or 30 years. Basic science. There used to be an optimism and a faith back at the time when John Kennedy was president or Lyndon Johnson was president, and people's response in the polls to whether government was doing a good job hovered at 60% or higher. Investment in basic science, not knowing what kind of spin-offs, not knowing what kind of developments will come from that, is something that we could reinvigorate at this time. It's obvious to anyone who looks at economic history that the size and the proportion of profitability of the financial sector has to go down over time. As Paul Volcker says, he can only see one financial innovation that makes a difference, and that's the ATM machine. Now, he may be cutting it a little tight, but I do spend a lot of time. Bernard, I used to work with the Senate Banking Committee, and I have gone through the bill. I've talked with lots of people. I've worked with Michael Greenberger on derivatives. I don't find too many financiers that can explain to me why 40% of all corporate profits, or last year 34%, ought to be in the financial sector, how that helps everyone else in a cooperative, social dynamic. I think the other questions that we have to ask is we are very vigorously at this moment subsidizing too big to fail institutions. People made an effort to try to diminish that or stop that. It wasn't successful. Those institutions are very strong. But the question I ask is, there are groups called angel investors and venture capitalists. If we're going to subsidize somebody and we need to make a transformation in the structure of our economy, why isn't that segment of the capital market the one we favor relative to the preservation of the creditors, stockholders, and managements of the firms that have caused so much discomfort and harm in recent years? If we're going to talk about deficit reduction, I used to be a bond speculator, and I'm very curious right now about those who think cutting Social Security is going to calm down the bond market. First of all, the bond market's not very enraged. It's acting like the economy's slowing down. But secondly, if I'm a bond speculator and you cut a bunch of diffuse senior citizens in the future, what do I think? I think powerful groups in the military, the pharmaceutical industry, finance, and others will actually see that capacity as something they can reach into and push us back to the brink of crisis. We will only create credible deficit reduction when powerful sectors, including upper income taxation potentially, or value-added taxes, or other things are added to the mixture. That is when the bond speculator can say, we're on a different track. I guess I should come to campaign finance reform. When one looks at a healthcare bill that essentially codified a great deal of monopoly practice in pharmaceuticals, in insurance, and in other aspects of hospital and healthcare delivery, when our costs are more than double the OECD average, when the World Health Organization rates the quality of our healthcare as 38th in the world, and far below the Netherlands that pays approximately 35% of what an American pays per capita right now, there are places where we can make a difference and alleviate fears about deficit reduction. We just didn't happen to have a political system that could produce that. So campaign finance reform, whether it relates to finance or healthcare or addressing our social interests in a myriad of frontiers, is not functioning well now, and I don't believe anyone in either party would dispute that statement. Finally, as we acknowledge that we are all afraid, as we acknowledge that our system, which has the tone of crony capitalism in its interface with the government, where the sectors of finance, military, oil, and pharmaceuticals and others have often made their money in the interface with the state. We've got to free our political system from what you might call protecting the already powerful. This is a very difficult agenda. I was talking to someone about this last night, and they said, well, I feel like we're on the Titanic, and the question is, do we tell the navigator how to get away from the icebergs, or do we try to get to the safe and put the jewels in our lifeboat and get out of here? But I grew up in Detroit, and I'm always attracted to Motown music. And Martha Reeves and the Vandellas have a very famous song called Nowhere to Run and Nowhere to Hide. The United States is the leader of the world system, and we all have nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Audiences like this, people like this, are the people who have to resist their own fears and put us back on that trajectory so that the pain does prove to be transient and not an ongoing phenomenon. Thank you.
I was waiting for you to break into a chorus of the song. Maybe at the end.
At the end, we can all do it.
Van Jones.
That's good. Well, first of all, it's good to be here. Good morning. Obviously, people who are here this early to talk about a subject like this care a great deal. Many of you are people who have, as political donors, as philanthropists, have invested your own blood, sweat, and tears in trying to avoid the decline of our country, and yet here we are on the bubble. I want to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that could actually make a tremendous difference in the short term and the long term. I think the worst part about the situation that we're in is that it's not because we don't have good ideas about how to fix it. Sometimes it seems very complicated. A lot of times it's just not. So I want to start off with a little story, since you told such a good one, about one of my favorite people in the world, Paul Hawken, who is an author. People know Paul Hawken? He wrote the Ecology of Commerce. He's an incredible ecological economist and wise, gentle. And he came to Oakland, where I've done a great deal of my work.